Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Christopher Dawes. I'm with the Federal Highway Administration in Washington, D.C. under normal circumstances. Today, we have our session on an introduction to protecting trails, a handbook for land acquisition for National Scenic and Historic Trails. We have the esteemed Don Owen, who's going to be presenting for us. Don regularly consults with a variety of land trusts and park and trail organizations, including the Land Trust Alliance, the Partnership for the National Trail System, Maryland Environmental Trust, West Virginia Land Trust, National Park Service, and he's been working for years on trying to protect our lands. I'm going to remind everybody that we are keeping everybody on mute for now. If you want to put questions in, please put them in the chat pod. You should see at the bottom of your screen, if you move your little cursor around at the bottom of your screen, you will see a chat function. You can open that, you can send messages, and we'll be keeping track of those. Later on, it's possible that depending on how the questions go, we may ask people to turn on their videos toward the end of the session, but that will be determined a little later. We have closed captioning available that will be turned on for the session. If you need assistance, please put your question in the chat pod. Have we seen the community agreement slide? Yes, yes, the community agreement slide. Please pay attention to this. We are all in a learning experience together. So we will have times when it's like, oh, well, this is new. Let's all learn together. So I want to point out to that. Okay, with that, we have Don Owen. Would you like to begin, Don?
So I'm going to assume at this point that everybody can see my screen. And I'd like to say welcome. I'm going to be talking, as Christopher said, about an introduction to a handbook for land acquisition for National Scenic and National Historic Trails. As Christopher said, I'm Don Owen. And I recognize many of your names and faces, but for those that don't know me, I'm a senior consultant for lands, trails, and parks. And if someone comes to the door, like the FedEx man, I may be joined by my golden retriever, who has a really deep, loud bark. And if he does join us, I'm going to ask Christopher or Chelsea to take over the controls for just a moment while I deal with whatever is at the front door. This is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about why we need to acquire land to protect National Scenic and National Historic Trails, about who can acquire land, how to plan for trail protection, how to acquire land or easements, and we'll also discuss some of the basic fundamentals of real estate. I'd also like to say that I'm not a lawyer. I'm not offering legal advice. And though I've spent most of my 40-year career protecting land, it is an absolutely vast and complex field, and I'm still learning every day. And I, in the handbook, cannot possibly cover the depth and breadth of land protection, land conservation. However, the handbook does have a number of resources that you can go to for further reading. Third, I noticed that there are several land protection experts on the call, and I'll invite them to speak up during the question and answer session if they have any additional thoughts. I'd like that question and answer session to be a collaborative session where we all have an opportunity to discuss some of the things that are in the handbook. And then what I'd like to tell you about is the handbook. Over the last year, I've been writing a handbook on how to protect National Scenic and National Historic Trails. It's a guide to land acquisition for trail administrators, managers, trail resource specialists and trail volunteers. It's not a how-to guide for a land protection specialist. It's not all-encompassing. It would be thousands of pages if it was. And unfortunately, it's not a novel and it won't ever be on the bestseller list, but it is a step-by-step guide on something that we all need, regardless of where we are in our trail protection program. It's a step-by-step guide to planning a trail protection program, funding a trail protection program, working with partners, negotiating with landowners, taking care of the due diligence steps of land acquisition, and then finally closing, recording, and celebrating the protection of your National Scenic or National Historic Trail.
Dawn, I'm going to jump in for just a minute. There's a little bit of background noise. I'm not sure if it's paper shuffling, but just wanted to make you aware.
Yeah, it might be paper shuffling. I'll try it. Thank you. These are some of the fundamental concepts that I'd like to discuss. And I know those of you have, many of you have heard this before. Land ownership in the United States now, for better or for worse, is based on English land law. The owner of the land gets to say what happens on that land, subject to local zoning. And owning an interest in land is really the only way that you can determine how and what happens on a particular parcel of land along your National Scenic or National Historic Trail. If you don't own that interest in the land, you don't have a say what happens there. And it can become the next shopping mall, it can become the next highway. Land ownership isn't perfect. You can still end up with a power line right of way across your property, but it does give you more control than anything else. So planning for and acquiring those interests should be our first and highest priority. The basic tool for permanent protection of a significant natural or cultural resource is what's called a corporeal or an incorporeal interest in the land. Corporeal interest is something that you can feel and touch. It's the trees, it's the land itself. An easement interest, which is really a negative interest that limits what can happen on that land, is an incorporeal interest in the land. These are the 16 chapters of the handbook, starting with an introduction, a review of the authorities, partnerships, and then an overview of the process, which goes from chapter 5 on planning all the way down to chapter 14 on closing and recording and celebrating your acquisition of a piece of property. Chapter 15 is what you get to do afterwards, after you own that interest. And then chapter 16 are 4 specific examples of successful trail protection projects. Chapter 1 outlines the purposes and contents of the book. Chapter 2 talks about the authorities, in particular the National Trail System Act authorities and the Land and Water Conservation Fund. It also goes into some other federal and state legislation that provides the basis for land protection by those federal and state agencies. Here's the authority from the National Trail System Act, Section 7E. Where the secretary charged with the administration of the National Scenic or National Historic Trail should encourage states and local governments to acquire interests in land that are to be utilized as section of that National Scenic or Historic Trail. And if that doesn't happen, the secretary is charged and given the authority to acquire those private lands or interests in land by donation, purchase, or exchange. There are additional limitations on land acquisition authority for each National Scenic Trail. It's basically willing seller only authority, with the exception of the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail, and the Natchez Trace Trail. Even for those trails these days, for 99.9% of the cases, it's a willing seller environment.
Dawn, one more time, I apologize. We're still getting quite a bit of ruffling, it sounds like, from your papers. So if they're close to your microphone, if you can just pull them a little bit further away, that would be probably quite helpful.
Does that help?
Yes, you sound pretty clear right now.
Okay.
Great, thanks so much.
Okay, sure. My apologies, everyone. So for National Historic Trails, the authority is limited to only those sections of land and water of a National Historic Trail that are administered by federally owned on federally owned property. And the acquisition does not need to be continuous. But those are the federal protection components of a National Historic Trail. They rely much more on state, local, or private land protection. Chapter 3, is that better, Chelsea?
Yeah, you sound a lot better.
Okay. Chapter 3 talks about partnerships. The Trail-administering agency, sometimes agencies in the nonprofit trail organizations, sometimes organizations, and other partners are critically important. There's a partnership that we haven't explored as much as we might, and that's partnerships with land trusts and conservation organizations. They are stepping up and stepping into the gap in many cases on national scenic and national historic trails and acquiring and protecting land in the absence of federal or state agency action. And it's extremely important that they do so. So who can acquire land? Land trusts can acquire land, trail organizations can acquire land, other nonprofit organizations, including local preservation groups. Conservation buyers can step in and acquire land, and then state, local, and federal land managing agencies all can acquire land by donation, by purchase, within the constraints of the enabling legislation that is provided in the National Trail System Act. So let's go back to one of those. Let's go back to land trusts. Land trusts come in all shapes and sizes. They use many different techniques. They have different missions, but they all have one thing in common. They save land to protect important scenic, historic, natural, or cultural or recreational values of land. And the most important point that I think I'd like to make when it comes to land trusts is that their mission may not align exactly with yours, but their job is to protect land. And you may find that they're an outstanding sister organization, and the best of them are what are called accredited land trust. Accreditation means that a land trust has passed through an extremely rigorous review process by the Land Trust Accreditation Commission. And there are about 450 land trusts that have accomplished that and made it all the way through that process and received an accredited seal from the Land Trust Accreditation Commission. That green seal makes a difference. And believe me, if you ask a land trust and they tell you that they're, whether they're accredited or not, if they're accredited, they're going to tell you. It is a very challenging process, and they're going to be very proud of it. I've worked with more than a dozen land trusts, helping them through that process at this point. And it is a significant achievement. It means that they are operating at the highest standards of the industry, and you'll find them much easier to work with and much more prepared to work with you. Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is an overview of the land acquisition process, starting with trail protection planning, looking for funding, taking you through the due diligence steps, and then taking you all the way through the negotiations to closing and recording of a transaction that protects a section of your trail. These are the steps. My favorite step is actually not the celebration, but the offer and acceptance. That's where the rubber meets the road. That's when you know that you've accomplished a contractual agreement with a landowner to protect a particular section of a national scenic or national historic trail. Chapter 5. Chapter 5 starts to dig into the planning process for a national scenic or national historic trail and works with a number of examples. Regardless of the trail, these are the steps you need to go through. You start with the legislative authority, and you complete a comprehensive plan. You identify the route of the trail and assess those key resources that should be protected. You complete the agency planning process, and then finally, you have the clearance to go ahead and act upon that plan. This is the planning process for the Appalachian Trail. Started with the comprehensive plan in 1981, went through a series of site-by-site analyses where the Appalachian Trail Project Office, as it was called, did analyses of segments of the Appalachian Trail. Once those analyses were complete, they were incorporated into the land protection plan, and it was subsequently amended time and time again, ultimately resulting in the protection of almost 3,000 tracts of land, 120,000 acres of land. For the Pacific Crest Trail also has a land acquisition or inventory process that's based in large part upon optimal location reviews. For those of you that aren't familiar with optimal location reviews, they've been adopted on several of the National Scenic Trails at this point. And they have helped those organizations establish quite simply, where the optimal location for a trail would be. This is the planning process for the Ice Age National Scenic Trail. It started with their comprehensive plan, worked through a county corridor planning process. Once that, and that happened on a county by county basis throughout the state of Wisconsin. And they're well past halfway at this point with, I think, 12 completed county corridor planning processes, 3 underway, and then 2 will get them pretty close to the finish line. Once those county by county corridor planning processes are complete, the triad of the National Park Service, Ice Age Trail Alignment, and Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources develop a trailway protection strategy based upon the county by county corridor planning processes. Moving over to National Historic Trails. This document was prepared by the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail National Park Service Office. It identifies about 80 different sites along the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail that qualify as high potential historic sites. And it also identifies the land ownership, whether it's entirely public, partially public and partially private, or entirely private. Another example of identifying where resources can be, or where significant resources are located, is on the Captain John Smith Chesapeake National Historic Trail, starting with the comprehensive plan, and then moving to a comprehensive strategy, a land protection strategy for the Captain John Smith Chesapeake National Historic Trail. That strategy really, I think, is perhaps the best strategy I've seen for identifying resources along a National Historic Trail and identifying which resources might need to be protected. They've taken that analysis and then broken it up according to the criteria that are outlined in the National Trail System Act, and then used a state-of-the-art scorecard methodology for identifying priorities. So Chapter 6 is where I think a lot of us probably are meeting the biggest challenges. Who decides what needs to be protected? Who protects the land? Who decides? Well, really the decision on what needs to be acquired to protect trail resources comes down to the trail-administering agency, ideally with input from a nonprofit organizational partner and other partners such as state or local agencies. Deciding who gets to take the lead is a challenge. It really does depend. It depends on who has the authority, who has the funding, who is willing to purchase the necessary interests in the land, and then finally, who is willing to hold and manage those interests in perpetuity. Chapter 6 begins talking about some of the fundamental concepts of real estate. I don't know if you've seen this graphic before, but you can look at land ownership as a bundle of rights or a bundle of sticks. And you can take out and divide those rights into about as many ways as a room full of lawyers can think of. You can have a right to an easement, you can have a right to timber rights, you can have a right to subdivide. All of those rights together are called fee simple. There are three basic approaches, though, that are particularly relevant to National Scenic and National Historic Trails. There's a fee simple transaction, there is a conservation easement, and there's a right-of-way easement. With a fee simple transaction, that's the whole bundle of sticks. There may be some rights that have already existed before your acquisition, such as a right of access that's across the property, or timber rights, or it could be that there's a county road right of way across the back of the property. You can still acquire the fee, but you acquire it subject to those existing third-party rights. For a conservation easement, you're talking about a negative easement that limits what can be done on the property. And that's done for conservation purposes. It's done to protect the scenic values. It can be done to protect the agricultural or forestal values. It can be done to protect historic values. Finally, and this is particularly important for National Scenic Trails, if you're acquiring less than fee, you need a right of access in most cases to get across that property from one end to the other so that you have continuous access. There are different ways to acquire the land. You can acquire it through purchase and sale, through donation, or through a combination of the two in what's called a bargain sale, in which you pay the landowner less than the full value of the interest that you're acquiring, and they donate the remainder of that. And then if they've done everything right, qualify for tax benefits on the remainder. You can also acquire, and this is rarely done, interest through exchange. A few more basic tenets of real estate. First in time, first in right. There may be prior existing rights to the land, and you can't interfere with those. You can go and negotiate separately to acquire those, but those rights predate your purchase, and you have to make sure that if there is a conflict between those rights and what you want to acquire, that you've had a conversation with and explained to the landowner or the third-party owner that you need to acquire those rights as well. Most rights run with the land and they survive the transfer of title. Leases may not, rental agreements may not, but most rights run with the land. I'll get into mortgages and liens a little bit later on the concept of subordination. But one of the important things to know is that most permanent rights to property are located in the local jurisdiction's land records. So Chapter 7, funding. Chapter 7 is all about where you can find money to acquire land. The landscape has changed significantly at this point, but we haven't even begun to feel it. This year, through what some people in the conservation industry refer to as the holy grail of conservation funding, Congress passed the Great American Outdoors Act, and part of that was full funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund at $900 million a year, along with the passage of the John Dingell Resource Management Act the previous year. That means that we have permanent full funding for Land and Water Conservation Fund, federal land acquisition, and state land acquisition every year in perpetuity. And that's going to really, really help. We have not reached full funding for decades. And now that we have permanent funding, we can start to really plan ahead. There are many more sources of funding besides Land and Water Conservation Fund. There are state sources, there are local sources. And then I've also discussed in the handbook a variety of different private sources for funding land acquisition. Preliminary negotiations. This is where it gets fun. Who gets to talk to a landowner? And what should you say and what shouldn't you say? You can talk to a landowner. I would suggest, as a matter of fact, I do more than suggest, I'd strongly suggest or recommend that you become trained in negotiations and you learn carefully what you can say and what you can't say. These are Kevin Thusius's rules of the road. Before I get to Kevin Thusius's rules of the road, this encapsulates the basic initial conversation that you can have about conserving land with the landowner. If you go up to and contact a landowner, the simplest thing to say is, would you ever be interested in selling or donating an interest in your property? And if the answer is no, you can ask, well, would you let us know if you ever do? If the answer is yes, you say, well, I'll let somebody in the agency or land trust know. The conversation can be that short and that simple. These are Kevin's guidelines for working with landowners. Be prepared, be local, be a good listener, sell the trail, suggest the opportunity to leave a legacy, know when to stop. Don't expect yes right away. Understand that the landowner is going to have different ideas about what to do with the land than you might. And then I've added one of my own, which is don't promise anything, because a landowner will remember everything that you say, and a landowner sees you as the representative of the trail organization. Chapter 9, mapping and legal descriptions. Why is a legal description important? Well, a legal description tells you what you're going to be acquiring. It's exact, since land is not something that you can, like a car that you can drive away. A legal description tells you exactly where the four corners of the property are, and serves as the basis for a deed transferring title to the property. If you don't know where the four corners of the property are, or if you're there appears to be some disagreement, a survey can accomplish exactly what you need. If you're acquiring anything less than a fee simple interest, a survey may be absolutely necessary. And if you're acquiring a conservation easement, you may want to have a survey as well, particularly if that conservation easement doesn't cover the entire property. That legal description can be a meets and bounds description, which is common in the East. It can be a township and range description or a platted subdivision. And surveys will allow you to accomplish any of those legal descriptions. Chapter 10 talks about title insurance and title investigation. What is it and why is it so important? Well, a lot of land trusts have skipped over this step, or at least have in the past. They're changing rapidly. And particularly accredited land trusts are paying attention to title investigation. You may think that you're dealing with the owner of a property. You may be talking to someone who says, yeah, I own that property. He may not. It may be owned by multiple partners. It may be owned by an LLC. The only way to assure that you are actually dealing with the owner of a property is to pay someone to do a title investigation, or have someone who's qualified to do so for you do it themselves. It tells you who owns the land, and it also tells you where any of those other bundle of the sticks, or where who the owner is, or who the holder is of any of those other bundle of sticks in the bundle of sticks. You can get a title abstract. You can get a title report. the gold standard is a title insurance policy in which a title insurance company indemnifies you if any of their work isn't accurate. Chapter 11, appraisals. Why do you need one? Well, you need an appraisal to tell you what the value of the property is. You don't want to pay more than the property is worth, and you don't want to pay less unless you and the landowner have agreed to do so. And actually, if you're the government, you can't. You have to offer a landowner full fair market value for the interest that you're acquiring. And that offer has to be based upon a qualified appraisal. Even if it's a donated interest, in which case the landowner is responsible for the appraisal because the landowner has to substantiate the value of their donated interest in the land. You still need to do an appraisal. And it's not just any appraisal, it's an appraisal for a conservation easement or a conservation value. An appraisal is a professional opinion of real property. It's done using comparable sales. There are other methods of doing it, but almost always an appraisal will come back to somebody doing a professional appraiser using comparable sales of similar properties and then making adjustments to arrive at a professional estimate of the fair market value. Appraisers and appraisals go through extremely difficult and challenging processes. If it's an appraisal for a government acquisition, there are review steps that are required. And just for the sake of time, I will skip the description of a before and after appraisal, but it's in the handbook and it's an important concept to learn. Chapter 12, environmental hazard assessment. This is a no-brainer, right? Well, you would think so. It's not. You should at least do an environmental transaction screen. And if a transaction screen identifies any potential issues, do a phase 1 report, and you can go to a phase 2 report. There's even a phase 3 report in which the investigation identifies what actually needs to be done to remediate the property. You would think that's a pretty common process, but 35, 40 years ago, it was not. The Superfund site legislation was new, and there were a number of transactions that took place on the Appalachian Trail where the National Park Service acquired almost 1,000 acres within the Palmerton Zinc Superfund site, and it took more than 30 years to clean everything up. Chapter 13 is final negotiations. Final negotiations are done based on the value, the fair market value as identified in the professional appraisal. The object of these final negotiations is agreement in the form of a purchase and sale agreement or a contract called an offer to sell or an offer to purchase. These are entirely voluntary, but when signed by both parties, become the basis for your final negotiation or for completion of your final negotiations. They include the price that has been agreed upon and all the terms and conditions that have been agreed to, as well as a date for closing or execution of the deed of conveyance. Chapter 14 are the final steps to ensure a legal transaction, legal review, closing, a bring down, and recordation in the county courthouse records. Once all of the authorized agents for all parties have signed off on the deed, a bring down makes sure that no last minute changes have taken place that are on the records in the local county courthouse. And then recording the deed is really a genuine cause for celebration. And celebration is important. Why is that? Well, because you have just accomplished something that will add immeasurably to your National Scenic or National Historic Trail. You now are the owners in perpetuity of a permanently protected part of your National Scenic or National Historic Trail, and the current and future generations will be able to enjoy it forever. So, Chapter 16, last but not least, there are two examples of protecting National Scenic and National Historic Trails. Chapter 1 is on the Trinity Divide transaction that took place on the Pacific Crest Trail. We heard about saving Phones Cliffs on Friday. The Phones Cliffs is on the Captain John Smith Chesapeake National Historic Trail. This case study is on the Ice Age Trail and 3 projects that they've completed over the last year to protect the Ice Age Trail in Dane County. And then last of all, the Alakakai Trail Association worked with their agency partners and the Trust for Public Land to protect 2,317 acres of land along the Alakakai National Historic Trail this past year, which I just consider to be a stunning achievement for a board of, for an organization with a board of 6 members. They're really to be congratulated for this. And with that, I'll open things up for questions. I'm going to stop the slide deck and turn things back over for a moment to Chelsea to just talk about how we're going to handle questions, answers, observations, anything you'd like to talk about for the next 15 minutes.
Dawn, while she's coming on, it's Liz Wessel, and there are some questions we've been capturing, so I'm sure Christopher can field those too.
Okay,
Great. Thank you, Don. Appreciate everything that you've been doing with this. Among questions, if I could get my screen to cooperate here. I'm sorry, screen is not cooperating here. Let me try this method. Okay. So first of all, we've had questions on when is the handbook likely to be available. That was asked again. You said so, but please remind us the steps for making the handbook available.
the handbook's going to be complete in draft form. It's not a final document, but it is, per our agreement with the Federal Highway Administration, a draft document that will be delivered November 20th. And then in December, we'll be distributing links to the handbook or to the draft handbook. It'll be up on the partnership's website sometime in December.
Okay, and the continuing that is actually subject to funding. So that is not yet secured, is my understanding. Okay. Question from Ron Tipton. Isn't the Forest Service also involved in Ice Age Trail planning in certain counties?
I believe so. And I don't know if Kevin Thusius or Mike Wilmer are on the call, but they could answer that question, or Pam Schuler, they could answer that question better than I.
All right, I don't, what was the first name again, please? I don't see.
Kevin Thusius?
No, I don't see those names on the chat pod. Okay, I'm going to move on.
I can follow up on that question, Ron.
Okay. Question for Don. There was a major Washington Post article about groups of investors purchasing conservation easements and receiving huge tax credits for not developing a major portion of the property acquired. This was presented as a big scam and said there is pending Senate legislation to limit tax credits. Is this type of easement acquisition a threat to the integrity of trail easements?
It's not a threat to the integrity of current trail easements, but what the questioner is referring to are what are called syndicated tax deals. And syndicated conservation easements are very much a problem. The Land Trust Alliance has come out very much in support of action by the Internal Revenue Service to flag and identify these transactions. Basically, what some less than scrupulous people have done is they've set up a land trust, and they have also set up these deals where they have acquired a piece of land. They seek investors for that piece of land who are looking for tax shelters. And then they promise those tax shelters that they will, those people looking for tax shelters, that they will put a conservation easement on the property with a land trust, and then divvy up the tax benefits. And by valuing the property at many, many times its actual value, people are getting consequential tax returns that are sometimes 5 and 10 times what they're actually investing in to begin with. It's not right. And I personally hope that Congress does take action to control those types of transactions.
Thank you.
While protecting the rest of the industry, which is operating ethically.
Right. And so this is why you talked about having accredited land trusts, that you brought that up. From Arby, we have love the practical application of this work. How long have you been working on this project?
I've been working on this handbook for the past 14 months. It's about 160 pages long. Again, it could be thousands of pages long if I were trying to capture everything that you might need to know to acquire land, but it's intended to provide a guide so that trail administrators, trail resource specialists, volunteers, and managers can understand how the process works and what it can accomplish, and what the outcome can be for your National Scenic or National Historic Trail.
Okay, and in anticipation, that's sort of similar to the next question. Don, can you repeat what you said about the difference between scenic and historic trail willing seller provisions of the Trails Act?
For all intents and purposes, we are working in a willing seller environment right now. And while the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail, and the Natchez Trace Trail have had the authority for years to acquire land by eminent domain, for all intents and purposes, that has been used very rarely to begin with, and hardly at all. I can't even remember any acquisition by anything other than willing seller in the last 15 to 20 years.
Okay, thank you. The next question from Kevin. What is a good way in getting started toward protecting our lands and getting involved with the NPS or other organizations involved with our trails?
Well, it's a great question. I think the first step is if you haven't completed a comprehensive plan, that needs to be done. But the next step is really an identification of what resources should be protected to provide for either for the public's use of and for the protection of resources along your National Scenic or National Historic Trail. I think the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail is a good case in point. They've identified 80 different national, what are called high potential historic sites along their trail, and identified who the landowners are, whether they're public, partially public and partially private, or private. That step will get you to the point where you can decide who might take the lead on protecting those sections of your trail. And if you don't have the resources, the land acquisition expertise, the Appalachian Trail Land Acquisition Office, where I used to work, has become the National Trails System Program Center, National Trail System Lands Program Center. It's also known as Don King's office, Joe Sabanovsky's office. And they can work with agencies that are interested in protecting national scenic and national historic trails. And other great resources, the Land Trust Alliance has a website called Find a Land Trust. And I'd be happy to put that information out for everybody. But basically it's a search function where you can find all the land trusts that are working in your area.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Jeremy. Now that LWCF, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, is permanently authorized and fully funded, are there new desired federal statutory reforms on the table? If so, what? And I'm actually going to jump in here. Some funding sources include federal transportation funding sources. For example, I'm responsible for the Recreational Trails Program, which can provide funding through the states. It can include acquisition from a willing seller. Eminent domain is not allowed in any way, shape, or form, but through the Recreational Trails Program. Now, the Federal Surface Transportation authorization has been extended. It expired September 30th. It has been extended through September 30th, 2021. That the Congress will be taking that up. They've actually already taken it up in some way, shapes, or forms, but whether or not it sees the light of day soon, or since they have a year to work on it. But federal surface transportation legislation is something to look at in terms of ability to, because some of these trails are eligible for federal surface transportation funds. So that's from my viewpoint. Don, you want to go ahead and answer the rest of the question?
I thought you did a great job. I'm not aware of any federal statutory reforms that are on the table. I know that all of the agencies that we work with, the National Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and the Forest Service, are in the process of developing inventories of projects that have been, in some cases, on their acquisition list for years, so that and they're promoting. We'll be submitting those lists to Congress. I hope that the Partnership for the National Trail System and the individual trail organizations are also encouraging their federal agency partners to look at specific trail projects. One of the other challenges that we're going to come across pretty quick is whether those agencies have the staff resources to be able to carry out all of these projects and spend the $900 million a year that will be available for land acquisition.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Donna. This handbook looks like an amazing resource. Yes, that's true. It seems like step one is to first develop a land acquisition strategy. Any tips on where to start?
Sure. I would suggest starting with the comprehensive plan and making sure that you have a good basis in your comprehensive plan to move forward. Chapters 5 and 6 go through this actual process. They show you how other trail agencies and or other agencies and trail organizations have gone through the process. I don't think that there's a perfect method that's been established, and I think that really what you have to do is look at what others have done and then adapt it so that it works for your national scenic or national historic trail. But I'm hopeful that chapters 5 and 6 will address this question for you.
Okay, thank you. And I see I skipped a question that, actually I want to ask, I'll ask a question about the planning chapter first. So from Becky, I have a question about the planning chapter. Will it contain recommendations about comprehensive plans and comprehensive planning, or does it just state what the current National Trail System Act requirements and agency policies are? And she says, thank you, great presentation. And after that one, I need to get to one that I missed on environmental hazards. Let's go for the planning one first.
Thank you, Becky. This handbook does not, but interestingly, something else that we've been asked to do as part of the cooperative agreement with the Federal Highway Administration is to take a look at the status of land acquisition planning, comprehensive planning for all of the National Scenic and National Historic Trails. And we will have a fairly brief, but hopefully informative paper that comes out also shortly after November 20th.
Okay, thank you. The question from Matt that I'm sorry, I think I forgot. Are these environmental hazard surveys standard for state and local acquisitions or just for federal?
Good question.
Dan, let me step in here. I
Sure.
do know that, for example, state transportation departments, when they purchase land to build for highways, they sometimes will do some hard negotiation. If you have hazardous waste on your property, they may want you to clean it up before they take it over, even though they're going to put a highway over it. So, Don, go ahead. How do people deal with environmental hazards?
Well, there's really two answers to that question. Most states at this point have developed similar legislation regarding environmental hazard surveys. If you're using what are called stateside land and water conservation funds, which are the Land and Water Conservation Fund has a federal side and has a state side. And if you're using those stateside funds, you're still required to do a survey to satisfy federal requirements. If you're not using that type of funding, that's not a requirement, but most states at this point and many local jurisdictions have developed policies that say you need to do one. Land trusts are not required by law to do this, but most land trusts at this point are doing at least what's called a screening to determine whether there's any potential there for hazardous materials.
Okay, thank you. We have lots of questions from Margaret Gorski. Does PNTS have a central place where we can go to get the citations for each of these documents? Don showed us great examples of planning for protection so that we could seek them out or find out how we can get copies of these documents. And I believe I put in the chat pod earlier that 4 of these are already on the partnership's website. So there should be a link in the chat pod. You can copy that link. We have studies available on, it's the one that just came out is protecting, I'm going to pronounce this wrong. I'm sorry, Kaleo. Waikapuna, and I'm not going to try to pronounce the Hawaiian, but it says he or she first cleared the path and then we younger ones followed. That's a study about the Alakahakai. There is one about Ice Age Trail, the Phones Cliff, which was presented on Friday, that's available, and then one on the Trinity Divide, the Pacific Crest Trail. So we have 4 studies already on the PNTS website.
The handbook will also be up on the partnership's website, and each chapter will have resources for further reading. At the end of the chapter will be resources for further reading with links to, and you can go as deep and as far and as wide as you can possibly go into the conservation, land conservation and protection world.
Okay, and I think I have 2 comments here. We're running short on time. 2 of the comments, one from Mike Dawson. Thank you, Mike. The rules of the road from the Ice Age study. Ice Age Trail Alliance reference to the do's and don'ts and a conversation with the landowner slide. Actually, Mike, I'm not sure what you mean here. Do you want to jump on since you're involved with this project as well?
So can you hear me?
Yes.
Just that Don talked about this as something from Kevin Enthusiast, but not everybody knows who he is or where that material came from. So it was just a note to make sure that folks knew that this stuff came from the Ice Age Trail Alliance.
Okay.
Kevin's the director of land conservation for the Ice Age Trail Alliance and has extensive experience in protecting national scenic trails.
Okay, thank you. And then from Donna, if you're looking for a land trust to partner with, check out the Land Trust Alliance website, which has
www.findalandtrust.org. Yes, excellent.
Okay. Let me see. Expected completion date, we did. Okay. Liz, do I have more questions? Have I missed any?
There was just one. Ron had a question about the Ice Age Trail. Isn't the Forest Service also involved in the Ice Age Trail planning in certain counties? And then I think it's time to wrap it up.
Yeah.
Gary Werner actually answered that question and said that the Forest Service is involved in Taylor County, the Medford district of the, I'm not even going to be able to pronounce it, Chiquamega-non-Nicolet National Forest. Hosts about 45 miles of the trail.
Okay, so thank you, everybody. I learned a lot. I think that we had a very successful session. I want to thank everybody for participating. We're going to have a survey.